deliberately pick up the baton from Gasset specifically and look at the conditions for which, I might do it in the piece that I'm doing now, maybe, but look at the conditions for which such a personality comes to the fore, right? If you go as extreme as Goldhagen did on the one end and say that the political representation of the totalitarian state is directly a consequence, and I'm not saying he necessarily said this, right? This is not to say that. This is what the discourse around Goldhagen's conception of the eliminationist anti-Semitism is. So whether I believe it is irrelevant. But the idea is you can go to one end and say that there is a representation from the mass in terms of the sadistic, if you will, the psychopathic, the pathological ruler, the tyrannical ruler, as a direct consequence of the desire in the population for that form of governance politically. And on the other hand, you have, and I think rather paradoxically, right? Rather paradoxically, you have a desire in the population for the type of ruler that allows the population, remember, not dominance control-based, but more rights-based, completely, I mean, we're talking the extreme, where the actual functioning of the state essentially decomposes because there really isn't any controlling structures. Right? Now that is advanced, right? You have one end where control is so institutionalized that the control of the individual living body is up for consideration. I don't want him to live, let's kill him. My control is strong enough that we calculate assassinations, right? If it's true that the new North Korean regime selectively exterminated and staged an accident in order to selectively assassinate 30 of its own members, then, I mean, think about the levels of control there. If it's the other case, that we want rights so much, and that the desire for rights within the population is so great that the population, from within the population, arises a leader that is only focused on grabbing as many rights as possible as it can for the population, then mechanisms of control weaken because the direction of the state is wholly towards, in a sense, in a very, I think both are terribly problematic, because then it's like, it's that instant gratification, right? Literally the service of the leader at that point is just to give the citizens everything that they desire. And we all know we can't give the citizens everything they desire. That's not an option, because the citizens desire some really sick shit, right? There are rights, but there isn't a right to everything. Some things are not, you know, if you get to that point, right, this is where you start to talk about institutional collapse, right? This is when the state implodes on itself because the state is just satisfying the heinous desires of the population. The population wants to get away with everything. Okay, so we want the right for this, we want the right for that, we want the right to... Next thing you know, you're discussing the rights to cannibalize people. I mean, if we're going to apocalypse and if the zombies are really coming out... oh, I hate even saying some of this stuff. Because then I'm going to be on the internet and I'll be reading an article on the rights to eat human beings, right? Think about how obscene that is, right? If the state is seriously going to contemplate a right like that and try to find means of gratifying and satisfying those rights, the state, there is no structure. There's no control. The whole idea of control is the ability to, I mean, this is Nietzsche, right? The whole idea of control is the ability to say thou shalt. I've said this in many lectures, right? The idea is that I don't want to go so far as saying the state is the dragon in terms of Nietzschean sense, because Nietzsche posits the dragon in terms of religious sense, but there is a sense in which the state, even me as a dad, I assume the role of the dragon to deny, right? You cannot, or you will, as Al-Farabi says, right? There is a sense of, what was the word, command? Compulsion, right? He uses the word compulsion, right? So that you have to act compulsively, right? So that with respect to obligation, then, we can't assume either of the two political extremes, right? And the names that these political extremes have, I could care less about. It's more the theoretical concept that's important. You can fill it in with your favorite totalitarian state, egalitarianist state, whatever. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so that's that. Top of page 6 then. Now we get to look specifically at the regimes. So we know the two types of evil. We know the three types of classes. And now we'll talk about the three types of regimes. So we know first the three types of classes: the philosophers, the followers, the citizens, roughly. I prefer the masters, the apprentices, the citizens. Same thing. We know the two forms of evil. We have evil as sort of just the immediate conceptual recognition of the antithetical relationship between misery on the one hand, happiness on the other. Right? Misery as opposed to eudaimonia as an end. Then we have a more egregious form, I would argue. Al-Farabi doesn't say this, but I would argue, and it's definitely justified, that a more egregious form, so to talk about stratified evil, a more egregious form of evil isn't just the recognition of this polemic, but first, the recognition of this polemic, misery as opposed to happiness, and then the desire to posit misery as telos, as goal. Anytime there is an intentful desire to posit misery as goal, individually, it manifests in the sadist. Anytime, collectively, there is a desire to posit misery as sort of the direction of the state, then it manifests in, it manifests in a totalitarian regime, if you will, right? In a fascist regime. Now, granted, some people I recognize say that they're good forms of fascism. I might not agree with that. I definitely don't agree with sort of tyrannical or totalitarians having any good form of a totalitarian state or good form of a tyrannical state. But the idea is, irrespective of that discourse, irrespective of all that sort of contemporary, I've read a couple of, or a lot of, political theory, and to be technically right, fascist state really isn't all directed towards evil, because the fascist state is really just trying to sort of regularity and conformity of its blah blah blah. Who cares? I'm already bored with that. The idea is, in terms of Al-Farabi, in terms of a contemporary application of Al-Farabi, we recognize that the desire for the state and of the state, for the state, from the population and of the state, as manifestation of political will, towards misery is going to be a cataclysmic failure. It is going to be human rights violation on a mind level. It's going to be egocentric, not in a good way, right? Not in a Nietzschean way. It's going to be egocentric, which is feeding the ego based on the misery of others, right? That's sadistically ego. So we know, again, the two forms of evil and the three classes. Now we're going to talk about the three regimes. The three regimes. So, here's a quote. The regime whose citizens have had no occasion to acquire any knowledge at all about divine and natural beings or about perfection of happiness. Right? So, the idea of divine and natural beings relates, again, the reason why I didn't incorporate it is because it's antiquated at this point in history, I think. Others might want to incorporate it. You might think that you can incorporate it. Buy the book, read it, and then make the incorporations for yourself. I'm not going to cover that section. It's like 2 pages because I don't find contemporary relevance for it. But that's a limitation of me in terms of interest, not intellectual ability. I'm just not interested in incorporating it. If you want to incorporate it, buy the book, read the section, you incorporate sort of the divine aspects. In terms of sort of natural beings, the idea is that individual human beings, again, are naturally born with freedom, which is a huge assumption, but individual human beings are born with freedom. Insofar as they're born with freedom, they have the freedom to choose. Insofar as they have the freedom to choose, they have the freedom to construct their government and governance. Okay, now here's a contingency, right? So contingency for happiness. Contingent because happiness for the population is contingent, It's not something that's given. And this is going to be super important, right? It's not something that's given because happiness is not a guarantee, right? The state doesn't guarantee